Jimmy. to today's hearing on school bus safety. It is a timely hearing with children out of school to see what needs to be done to keep them safe. And I'm interested in keeping them safe not only on school buses and as they get off of school buses, but I'm interested in keeping them safe in the streets as they go to school. It is true that school buses have a relatively safe safety record. It is also true that children are injured every day or every year, in bus-related crashes. More than I believe in most accidents, we owe it to our children, to these students, to examine why these fatalities occur and what can be done to prevent them. There are some school districts and school buses in my own district, but most take other modes of transportation, including walking, biking, or riding in a car, going on public transportation. Children are often at greater risk outside a school bus than inside it. We have figures showing 264 students who died in school transportation-related accidents in the last 10 years. 97 were struck by a vehicle while walking near the bus. We are going to hear today from what Congress can do to stop violations by drivers who illegally pass school buses loading or unloading passengers and to reduce fatalities and injuries as a result of these crashes. But as I indicated, I'm interested in what we can do about children and whether or not they're on or off of buses. The burden of providing school transportation, we're aware, of course, falls on the states and local districts. Some states are ahead of others in improving school bus safety. We note the state of New Jersey, which I'm pleased is representative today, and I look forward to hearing what Congress can do to help ensure that we have safe vehicles. I want to thank each of the witnesses for appearing today. We will listen very attentively in what the Congress can do, recognizing how much of the responsibility falls on the states. Excuse me, please. I'm pleased to recognize Mr. Davis, our ranking. I'm pleased to recognize Mr. Davis, our ranking member.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I want to welcome everyone to today's hearing. Today, the subcommittee will focus on school bus safety as part of our ongoing work to reauthorize federal surface transportation programs and policies. With nearly 500,000 school buses transporting more than 25 million school-aged children to and from school each day, school bus safety is an important part of this discussion. Statistics show that the school bus is the safest and most regulated vehicle on the road. In fact, according to the American School Bus Council, children are 70 times more likely to get to school safely when taking a bus when compared to walking, biking, or even traveling by car. With that said, NHTSA's most recent estimates indicate that school bus crashes account for approximately 0.4% of all traffic fatalities, and that's on a nationwide basis. No matter how safe the statistics show school buses are, we unfortunately see approximately 4 to 6 school-aged children die each year on the school bus. and another 10 to 15 die as a result of cars illegally passing school buses. Each fatality resulting from a school bus crash is more than a statistic. And just this last December, in my congressional district outside of Bloomington Normal, we saw a tragic accident where a truck collided with a school bus transporting a local basketball team home from a game. 2 adults lost their lives in that accident. 9 others were injured, including 8 students. As we work to reauthorize surface transportation programs and policies, it's my hope that we can address school bus safety in a bipartisan manner that prevents such instances from occurring in the future. And looking at that work, this subcommittee has jurisdiction over 2 agencies that play an important role in school bus safety, NHTSA and FMCSA. NHTSA sets the federal motor vehicle safety standards for school bus safety features, provides in-service training for bus drivers, and develops public awareness programs related to school bus safety. The other, FMCSA, establishes rules for commercial driver's licensing and requires school bus drivers to have a CDL with a special school bus endorsement. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses about ways that we can make our school-age children safer as they wait for, load and unload, and ride a school bus. And with that, I want to thank our witnesses for being with us this morning, and I look forward to hearing their testimony, and I yield back to the chair.
DeFazio. I have to recognize Mr.
We
DeFazio.
need you to do this so that we have members not on the subcommittee.
I'm pleased to recognize the ranking member, Mr. DeFazio, to ask if he has an opening statement.
Well, I think I became chair, but thank you. This is our second safety hearing of the year leading up to reauthorization. The first hearing, we heard testimony about highway fatalities, 100 people dying every day in motor vehicle accidents. That's a life every 15 minutes, 37,133 in 2017, and we need to look at ways to reduce those fatalities. Obviously, we're doing a lot better with the transportation of our precious kids on their way to and from school on school buses, but it's not perfect. We will hear some conflicting testimony today, and I would hope that members of the panel might depart from their prepared remarks and respond to someone who goes earlier. For instance, Mr. Benish from the NSTA is going to come out quite strongly against any federal mandate on school buses for seatbelts. And yet the NTSB is going to talk about what they see as and have felt for some time, a need for lap and shoulder. And then we're going to hear from Chief Fulton about how New Jersey is doing what others say is not possible because of seat configuration, size of children, and that. And that'll be an interesting contrast. I think there's much more substantial agreement on finding ways to better identify the bad apples out there, those who have had poor driving records, those who've had significant health issues and other things. There have been states that have moved forward with much more prompt notification. New Jersey, I think, is on a daily basis, any violations by school bus drivers. And so looking at the national CDL registry and other things that the federal government does control, might provide some benefit in those areas. So, I look forward to the testimony, and this will help instruct us on whether or not we need to include any new provisions in the surface transportation reauthorization, which I expect to have done hopefully by early next year. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Chairman DeFazio, and I note that the majority leader says that it will give priority to infrastructure, and maybe this hearing will provide us with more with information that could be included in any new bill. I did not use all of my time, and I am pleased to yield my remaining time 2.5 minutes to Mr. Cohen, who has had an experience that I think is the best way to lead off this hearing. I yield my good friend from Tennessee 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In 2016, there were unfortunately 2 school bus crashes that were most notable in the country. One was in Baltimore and one was in Chattanooga, my home state. A total of 12 children were killed. In Chattanooga, there were 6 children killed and 20 injured. After those crashes, the National Transportation Safety Board issued a series of safety recommendations to the Highway Traffic Safety Administration, and that was great. And they issued them to the administration and to the states to improve school bus safety. One of the recommendations included that states should enact laws to have all new large school buses equipped with 3-point seatbelts. Other recommendations included safety measures such as inclusion of collision avoidance systems and automatic emergency braking technology. Sadly and unfortunately and kind of unfathomably, the National Highway Transportation and Safety Administration has not initiated the process to enshrine any of these life-saving measures into federal regulation. And why, I have no idea, and they shouldn't. They should have acted before this. Today, I introduced H.R. 3959, the School Bus Safety Act, with Senator Tammy Duckworth, which implements those recommendations to make school buses safer by ensuring that all seat belts that will be at every seat, and buses are equipped with stability control and automatic braking system. It will also include fire protection standards, such as requiring school buses to be equipped with fire suppression systems to address engine fires. Additionally, the bill would create a grant program to help school districts modify school buses to meet these safety modifications. I'm hopeful Congress will work to enact these long overdue measures. There's no more precious cargo than our children and our school children whenever there's an accident. I've been trying to do this since I was a state senator. I know it's difficult to get beyond the industries, but it's something we need to do, and school and safety belts will save lives. So I yield back and thank the chairman for her time.
I thank the gentleman from Tennessee. I ask unanimous consent that the chair be authorized to declare recesses during today's hearing without objection, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearing and ask questions. I'm going to introduce the panel of witnesses, but before I introduce them all, I'm going to yield to Mr. Davis to introduce Mr. John Benish.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm pleased to introduce John Benish Jr., the president of the National School Transportation Association and a resident of the great state of Illinois. John, Mr. Benish, thanks for testifying today, and thank you for all of the commendable work you and the other bus operators do in keeping our kids safe. The overwhelming number of kids that travel safely back and forth to our schools every day on your school buses ought to also be commended. We ought to address the issues in transportation safety regarding school buses and other modes of transportation, but let's not ever forget the fact that there is an overwhelming amount of students, the overwhelming majority, that arrive safely, go home safely, and do it again the next day until they graduate high school like my kids did this year. So no more school buses for me for a while, but thanks for your service and thanks for being here today.
Well, thank you, Mr. Davis. I'm simply going to run down the names of the witnesses and then call on the first witness. We're pleased to welcome the Honorable Andrew J. McLean, House Chairman, Joint Standing Committee on Transportation, Maine State Legislature, who is here on behalf of the National Conference of State Legislatures. In addition, the Honorable Brenda Sue Fulton, Chair and Chief Administrator, New Jersey Motor Vehicle Commission. Also, Ms. Kristen Poland, Dr. Poland, Deputy Director, Office of Highway Safety, National Transportation Safety Board, Ms. Ann Farrow, the President and CEO of the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators, and finally, Mr. Matthew Condren, Secretary Treasurer, Teamsters Local, 384 Norristown, Pennsylvania. Forgive my coughing cold, but welcome all of you. And we're going to proceed left to right. Try to give your testimony within 5 minutes, your opening statements, rather, within 5 minutes. I would like to welcome, I'll ask first to speak Mr. McLean, who's speaking for the National Conference of State Legislatures. You may proceed. Turn on your microphone.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Chairman Holmes Norton, Ranking Member Davis, and distinguished members of the House Subcommittee on Highways and Transit. My name is Andrew McLean. I am House Chair of the Maine Joint Standing Committee on Transportation and co-chair of the National Conference of State Legislatures, National Resources and Infrastructure Committee. I appear before you today on behalf of NCSL, a bipartisan organization representing the 50 state legislatures and legislatures of our nation's commonwealths, territories, possessions, and District of Columbia. Every school day, more than 25 million children climb into 485,000 buses across the country that take them to and from school-related activities. Thankfully, school buses are statistically the safest way to transport school children. However, 61 children who were school bus occupants died in crashes between 2008 and 2017, and this is 61 children too many. States across the nation have responded to these tragedies with laws that NCSL has determined fall into 3 distinct categories: laws requiring seatbelts on school buses, laws authorizing cameras mounted on stop arms to cite drivers that illegally pass a stopped school bus, and laws making changes to requirements for school bus drivers. Overall, 35 states have debated more than 250 school safety bills in 2018, and 33 states have considered more than 200 bills in 2019 thus far. Compare this only to 132 bills in 2014 and 173 bills in 2015. You can see that there has been an uptick in legislative interest in school bus safety. School buses are designed to protect riders through compartmentalization using structural safety features such as high energy absorbing seat backs and closely spaced seats so children are kept snug. However, these features don't necessarily protect children the way seatbelts do during side impact crashes or high-speed rollovers, when passengers can be thrown from their seats. In May of 2018, a school bus crash took the life of 1 student and 1 teacher in Paramus, New Jersey. In response, New Jersey enacted legislation requiring lap shoulder seatbelts instead of solely lap belts. In addition to New Jersey, 7 other states require seatbelts on school buses. In 2018, more than 108,000 school bus drivers observed almost 84,000 vehicles illegally passing school buses in one single day. Thankfully, most state laws require vehicles on both sides of the road without a median to stop and remain stopped while a school bus stop arms and flashing red lights are deployed. In 2014, Wyoming became the first state to require all school buses to be equipped with a camera system to capture images of motorists illegally passing stopped school buses. States have also added language to address privacy concerns. Alabama's law requires that images or video not include the face of a driver or passengers and be destroyed within 90 days if there is no violation. Overall, 21 states explicitly allow local governments or school districts to use cameras to capture images and issue tickets for drivers who illegally pass stopped school buses. States have also moved to increase penalties for illegally passing a stopped school bus. Illinois now requires the revocation of a driver's license when someone illegally passes a school bus and the violation leads to a motor vehicle crash resulting in death. Finally, I'd like to highlight how states have strengthened their requirements for school bus drivers. For example, New York enacted a bill that requires all school bus drivers to take pre-employment alcohol and drug testing, as well as be subject to random testing, with all drivers required to be included in the random testing pool. States have also increased school bus driver training requirements. Rhode Island, for example, enacted a law requiring that annual training for school bus drivers include NHTSA's School Bus Driver In-Service Training Series. This is my 4th term serving as state legislator in the Maine House of Representatives, and my 3rd term chairing our Transportation Committee. And I can say that this past session was the most active in terms of legislation addressing school bus safety. Just over a month ago, in mid-June, Maine passed 2 specific bills focused on school bus safety. LD 19 will now require school buses purchased after this year to be equipped with a school bus crossing arm, and LD 166 addressed the issue of cars passing school buses. Initially, there was interest in simply increasing fines for violators, but we know that simply increasing the penalties does not actually solve the problem. We engaged stakeholders, including community members and local and state police, and this working group identified that enforcement of existing laws is the challenge because there is no way to identify a vehicle when the bus driver is the only person to have witnessed the violation. Thus, the working group recommended allowing the use of a traffic surveillance camera mounted on a school bus in conjunction with a lighted traffic control device to prove or enforce a violation in order to identify the violator. This bill was very controversial given our state's high regard for privacy. However, the testimony from grieving parents and community members was powerful and convincing. Too many kids are being hurt or killed while they're near a school bus. Madam Chairman, I thank you for this opportunity to testify before the subcommittee on this important topic, and I look forward to the subcommittee's questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. McLean. Next, the Chair and Chief Administrator of the New Jersey Motor Vehicle Commission, Brenda Sue Fulton.
Thank you and good afternoon, Chair Norton, Ranking Member Davis, members of the subcommittee. I'm here representing the New Jersey Motor Vehicle Commission and Governor Murphy, and we're grateful for the opportunity to speak on such an important topic. Last year, as you heard, a school bus crash in Mount Olive, New Jersey tragically took the lives of Eastbrook Middle School fifth grader Miranda Vargas and Paramus social studies teacher Jennifer Williamson, and injured dozens of children. This crash broke our hearts and caused us to take a hard look at how we keep our kids safe. New Jersey is second to none in ensuring that children who ride our school buses are safe. Every one of our 23,000 school buses is inspected at least twice a year with a review of driver qualifications as well as vehicle safety. Our Governor's School Bus Safety Task Force conducts an additional 100 unannounced inspections. Unannounced inspections have been particularly critical to help identify private operators who have unlicensed or otherwise unqualified drivers operating their school buses. We started requiring lap belts on all school buses in 1992, and we remain one of only 7 states that require belts on all school buses. In 1996, we started requiring every bus to be equipped with a crossing arm that swings out and prevents children from passing directly in front of the bus. This was modeled after Betsy's Law in Washington State. In 2017, with the passing of Abigail's Law, all New Jersey school buses were required to have sensors in front and in back to detect an object or small child below the field of view. Every work night, the Motor Vehicle Commission generates a report of any school bus driver whose license has been suspended and transmits that report directly to the New Jersey Department of Education for action. But after the devastating loss of Jennifer Williamson and 10-year-old Miranda, we resolved to do even more. In the first 2 years of his administration, Governor Murphy signed 8 laws aimed at improving the safety of school buses, drivers, and supervisors. These laws now require the following. 1, all newly purchased school buses must have 3-point belts. 2, in the past, school bus drivers who accumulated 12 or more points were scheduled for suspension. Under recently enacted legislation, they are now scheduled for suspension if they receive 3 or more moving violations in a 3-year period, or 6 or more points, and they must complete a defensive driving course before being restored. 3, local boards of education or the bus contractor that provides the pupil transportation services are notified by the Department of Ed of suspensions within 1 working day and must confirm within 1 business day that the suspended driver is no longer operating a school bus. 4, in addition to the commercial driver license requirement for medical certification from a federal medical examiner every 2 years, school bus drivers aged 70 to 74 must provide evidence of a medical exam every year, and drivers aged 75 and over must provide evidence of an exam every 6 months. 5, the state's conducting a study of school bus passenger safety, and 6, finally, at the local level, school bus drivers and school bus aides must now complete training biannually and school district transportation survivors must complete an approved certification program at an institute of higher education. In some respects, we are fortunate that our governor, education commissioner, state legislators, and members of Congress have all pulled together to enact measures to make our kids safer. But it hasn't escaped anyone's notice that too many of these laws have names: Betsy, Abigail, Miranda. Too many tragedies, too much loss. If I could convey any message to our sister states and to you, members of this committee, it would be this: don't wait for another child to die before you take action. I welcome your questions. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Appreciate that moving testimony. Dr. Poland, Deputy Director, Highway Safety Transportation Safety Board.
Good afternoon, Chairwoman Norton, Ranking Member Davis, and the members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting the NTSB to testify today regarding school bus safety. School bus travel, as you've heard, is one of the safest forms of transportation on our roads today. Children are safer traveling in school buses than in any other vehicle, but still, improvements can be made. Today, I will focus my remarks on NTSB recommended improvements related to occupant protection, driver oversight, fire protection, and the safety of children in the school bus loading zone. Compartmentalization, the current form of occupant protection on large school buses, is a passive system that performs well in frontal collisions. Unfortunately, in side impact collisions and rollovers, compartmentalization is incomplete and provides insufficient protection. 20 years ago, we recommended that NHTSA develop performance standards for school bus occupant protection systems that account for all types of collisions and rollovers. In 2008, NHTSA published a final rule that established standards for both lap and lap shoulder belts if voluntarily installed on large school buses. With the federal regulation in place, some jurisdictions are now equipping buses with this safety improvement. However, there still is no federal requirement for large school buses to be equipped with passenger lap shoulder belts. Additional, more recent school bus crashes have emphasized the need for change. Last year, following the catastrophic school bus crash in Chattanooga, Tennessee, the NTSB recommended that each state require passenger lap shoulder belts to be installed in new large school buses. Poor driver oversight resulted in unsafe school bus operations in both the Chattanooga crash and another 2016 crash in Baltimore, Maryland. In each case, the drivers continued to operate school buses unsafely with no remedial action being taken, even in the face of known driver safety issues. Improving driver oversight can prevent crashes. In the Chattanooga crash, the bus driver had about 5 months of school bus driving experience, during which he had accumulated numerous complaints about his driving performance. There was no systematic method for recording, tracking, or investigating complaints of driver behavior. In the Baltimore crash, the driver had a long-standing seizure disorder, yet was allowed to continue driving the school bus. We concluded that the driver understood his diagnosis of epilepsy and intentionally hid this during his medical examination. Further, although Baltimore City Public Schools was responsible for driver oversight, it failed to identify the bus driver as high risk. The NTSB has investigated several bus fires dating back to the 1988 bus collision near Carrollton, Kentucky that resulted in 27 deaths. More recently, in December 2017, a fire ignited in the engine compartment of a school bus in Oakland, Iowa, and spread into the bus's passenger compartment, resulting in 2 deaths. The bus was not equipped with an automatic fire suppression system that would have delivered a fire suppressant inside the vehicle's engine compartment, increasing the time to evacuate. We issued recommendations to NHTSA to require the installation of fire suppression systems in school buses. We also addressed similar recommendations directly to the school bus manufacturers. In addition, we recommended that NHTSA update the requirements for flammability of school bus interior materials. We know that more children are injured or killed in the school bus loading zone than on the bus itself. Following our investigation of a 2016 collision in which a child was fatally struck while crossing the roadway to board his school bus in Thief River Falls, Minnesota, the board recommended that NHTSA assess and update the guidelines on pupil transportation safety to address pedestrian issues related to conspicuity and route selection. We are now investigating 3 additional loading zone crashes in Indiana, Georgia, and Mississippi in order to identify countermeasures for preventing or mitigating future injuries and fatalities in the school bus loading zone. Thank you for the opportunity to provide our recommendations for improving school bus safety. I would be pleased to answer any questions you have.
Thank you, Dr. Poland. Mr. Benish, President and CEO, Cook Illinois Corporation, who's testifying on behalf of the National School Transportation Association. You may proceed. 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chairwoman Norton, Ranking Members Davis, Chairman DeFazio, Ranking Members Graves, member of subcommittee. Thank you for calling this hearing today and the invitation to testify. My name is John Benish Jr. I am the President and Chief Operating Officer of Cook Illinois Corporation, based in Oak Brook, Illinois. I'd like to also acknowledge my wife, Christine, who is here with me today. My dad, John Benish Sr., started the company in 1958 with 75 buses. Today, the company operates 2,200 school buses, and we transport over 100,000 children each day in the Chicagoland area. I started in the business as a teenager and have worked nearly every position, including CDL licensed driver, and occasionally you will even see me driving one of our buses to keep in touch with our drivers and our students. I am here today on the behalf of the National School Transportation Association, the trade association for private school bus companies that provide school bus service under contract. Private companies provide approximately 38% of the nation's school bus service. I just became the new president yesterday at our annual meeting in Austin, Texas. We have a saying in our industry that we bleed yellow, which signifies our commitment to safety for the children we transport. Each day, nearly 500,000 school buses transport over 26 million students to and from school. And to and from school, more than intercity, transit, rail, and aviation combined. According to DOT, the school bus is the safest form of transportation, surface transportation. And NHTSA states, the school bus is the safest vehicle on the road. School buses operate in road and highway environments where approximately 37,000 fatalities occur annually. School bus transportation averages only 4 to 6 occupant fatalities annually, which is 0.01% of the total fatalities. We mourn with the entire school transportation community and families when these rare incidents occur and attempt to learn from these accidents to ensure continued safe student transportation. Despite the unparalleled safety record of the school bus transportation, children remain vulnerable during the portion of the trip when they are waiting for the bus stops, crossing streets, and loading and unloading from the school bus. DOT statistics show an average of 22 students are killed annually outside the school bus, compared to the average of 4 or 6 students who are killed inside the school bus. Passing of stopped school buses, illegal in all 50 states, has reached epidemic proportions. Observational surveys indicate an estimated 15 million vehicles illegally passed stopped school buses in a 180-day school year. Sometimes pictures speak louder than words, so at this point I'd like to ask you to view this short video clip of an illegal passing incident that occurred with one of our members in New Jersey last December. This child walked away with a few broken bones, but sometimes illegal passing has tragic consequences. Last October in Rochester, Indiana, 3 children from one family were killed by an oncoming driver who failed to stop their kids were crossing the road to board the school bus. These tragedies can be prevented. We believe this is the most important issue facing the school bus transportation industry, eclipsing all others. This is why we are enthusiastically supporting bipartisan bill introduced in the House by Representatives Walorski and Brownlee, the Stop 4 School Bus Act. I'd like to ask for a revised support letter from multiple additional associations to be inserted into the record. If we are serious about saving more children's lives, this is the issue to tackle. Regarding seatbelts in school buses, we believe this issue is most appropriately decided at the state and local level closest to the funding streams for schools, for school transportation, and where all ramifications of decision to mandate school buses can be fully examined. NHTSA has refused to mandate school bus seatbelts on large buses at the federal level due to the fact that it would force more children into more unsafe modes of transportation. As communities are compelled to make difficult budget decisions, we stand with NHTSA on this issue. We look forward to continue work with the committee toward the common goal of keeping our children safe. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to answering any of your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Benish. President Ann Farrow, American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators. You may proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Chair Norton, Ranking Member Davis, thank you for the opportunity to be here today with this distinguished panel to speak on the important issue of school bus safety. I'm here on behalf of AMVA, a tax-exempt nonprofit organization that develops model programs in motor vehicle administration, law enforcement, and highway safety. Our mission is to support the state and provincial and territorial officials in the U.S. and Canada who administer and enforce motor vehicle laws. Our North Star is safety, safe drivers, safe vehicles, secure identities, and saving lives. With our members' guidance, we develop programs to encourage uniformity and reciprocity in the administration of these challenges across state and international borders. A good illustration of AMVA's work is in our support of our state members in their efforts to comply with national laws governing commercial drivers. Just one example. In that role, the supporting role, we support and facilitate the development of best practices on CDL testing. We facilitate an understanding and communication on federal requirements and those changes that come about periodically. And we work on both building and supporting and operating the IT applications and networks across which CDL driver convictions, suspensions, and other cancel actions are transmitted, otherwise known as SIDLIS. We rely heavily on our jurisdiction members to guide our association's work, and we consider the DMVs and Highway Safety Agency members to be the experts in these areas. So with this in mind and understanding we've got a very distinguished panel of jurisdiction leaders at the table, far more qualified to speak on their state-specific programs, I've limited my written comments to several national programs in which AMVA may or may not or is currently involved. The National Employer Notification System, the concept, or I should say the transmission of driver medical fitness data, and some background in that written testimony on the Commercial Driver's License Information System, the network across which so much of that travels. I look forward to the committee's discussion and to your questions, and thank you again for the opportunity to join this panel today.
Thank you, President Farrow. Secretary Treasurer Matthew Condren, Teamsters Local 384, Norristown, Pennsylvania. Please step forward.
Chairwoman Norton, Chairman DeFazio, Ranking Member Davis, members of the subcommittee, thank you for having me here to testify today. My name is Matt Condren, and I am the Secretary Treasurer of Teamsters Local 384 out of Norristown, Pennsylvania. I also work as a member of the First Student National Master Agreement Negotiating Committee for the Teamsters, where I set up national contracting goals and policies for Teamsters school bus drivers across the country. I am honored to be here today to convey the safety concerns of the more than 30,000 school bus drivers, monitors, and mechanics we represent. These hardworking men and women who I've had an honor of representing for over 18 years need your help to make their industry and their jobs safer. Federal laws and regulations do almost nothing to help school bus drivers. Once a school bus comes off the manufacturing line, There are no federal rules requiring that it be kept in a safe working condition. Many people are shocked to learn that the U.S. government plays almost no role in setting minimum standards for school bus operations in our country. This is a recipe for disaster. Private companies whose business is to make money or small school districts strapped for cash are often left to decide whether investing in safe drivers and new buses is a smart financial decision instead of whether it is the right one. This should never be just a dollars and cents calculation. It should be based on what is safest for our children each and every time. In my view, many of these problems come down to the lack of rules governing school bus operations across the country. The privatized school bus industry gives us a perfect example of this. Almost 1/3 of school bus operations in this nation are privatized, but there are no national standards dictating what an unsafe and unreasonable bid by a private contractor to do this work is. Almost any bus company can come off the street and make a bid to take your kids to school. Oftentimes, this means that small mom-and-pop bus companies who don't have the money to invest in new buses or don't pay the drivers enough to keep qualified people in the driver's seat will come in and offer way less than they should to do this work. You may think that no school district would accept this kind of offer, and I wish you were right, but in many cases, school districts are forced by law to accept the lowest bid they receive. And for cash-strapped school districts, saving money anywhere, they can be appealing no matter what the long-term cost. This practice also puts safe and responsible carriers who are trying to do the right thing at a disadvantage. Unionized carriers who are forced to take care of their buses and reward safe drivers are punished for making those investments. They are undercut by companies who don't invest in things that every bus company should be forced to invest in: proper maintenance of their buses, paying drivers a decent wage so that good drivers will stick around from year to year, and more. Safety shouldn't be open for competition. It should be something that every school district has to invest in no matter what. So what can Congress and the federal government do to fix this? You can make sure there are basic standards in place so that no school district falls through the cracks. When companies bid on a job, you should make sure they actually have enough buses to do the work. When they don't, kids are taken to school in overcrowded vehicles, sitting in the aisles and on top of each other, putting them in an enormous danger. If there is a crash or even a sharp turn on a windy road, you need to make sure that anyone bidding on a bus route has a real maintenance program in place so that kids aren't being taken to school on a bus with a broken stop sign, bald tires, broken mirrors, brakes that have never been inspected, or worse. You need to make sure that companies have real driver training programs in place so that a driver who just got his CDL and has never driven a day in his life knows the basics of what to do and what not to do when there are 50 screaming children in the back of their bus. And most importantly, you need to make sure drivers get a decent wage and real benefits so that good, safe drivers want to do this job, and once they are here, they stay here. The people we ask to drive our children to school are some of the lowest paid professionals drivers in this country. They make a national median wage of $16 an hour and usually don't get to work 40 hours in a week. They only get paid for 9 months a year, unlike other school employees. Many of them can't afford to take a day off if they are too sick to drive, and oftentimes they'll be reprimanded or fired if they do. Many drivers need to work multiple jobs just to make ends meet, so they're exhausted when they show up to drive their route. Is that how you want someone who is driving your kid to school to be treated? The lack of federal oversight of even the most basic safety standards for school bus drivers puts us all at risk. It's time for Congress to take the lead and drive up standards in this industry so that no child is put in harm's way on their way to school. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Secretary Condren. I was amazed to see that so many school bus drivers might not even be in anybody's jurisdiction because it's been privatized. This is something the committee has to look at. I'm going to begin with with questions. First of all, we heard many things that need to be changed and many helpful suggestions from you. Now, remembering that we are federal authorities, this is the Congress, and much of the jurisdiction lies in the states. So I would like to ask each of you, as my first question, to focus on the federal government. And I'm looking for you to indicate what priority do you think Congress should place of the improvements that are needed that the Congress could implement? Which would be your priority? Now, many of you had a number of different kinds of things that needed to be done. I'm going to start with Mr. McLean and going on down the line and ask you that first question. What priority for the Congress?
Thank you very much for your question. Generally speaking, we prefer the states prefer a carrot versus a stick. One of the great things about our democracy is that we have so many laboratories of democracy. Different states are exploring different solutions.
So you don't think there's something that the Congress can do for a carrot or a stick?
I do think that there are several different things that the federal government can do. One is research the effectiveness of different solutions that states are exploring. So one of the things that I mentioned in my testimony, we're exploring the stop arms, we're exploring the crossing guards. There's very little data on what is actually going to solve the problem of kids being hurt and killed on and around school buses. And so continuing with the research about effective strategies is one way the federal government can play a role. Additionally, incentivizing safety programs within states is a really important tool to incentivize different states.
I don't know how you, I need to go down the line. Incentivizing is a very broad, is a very broad word, but Ms. Fulton?
Thank you, Madam Chair. From our standpoint, I would prioritize a notification system that crosses states. You know, in New Jersey, our drivers are driving at other states quite frequently. And
Identification systems, did you say identification systems?
I'm sorry, a notification system.
Notification.
So if a New Jersey, let me give you an example. If a New Jersey driver's convicted outside the state, we do get notice that they've got a suspension and we can notify. But if a New York driver offends in our state, that notice may be sent through the mail and may take a period of time before New York finds out that the school bus driver was convicted of something that put them over the number of points. So the systems to go, there is we've gotten a lot of support from the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators, AMVA, and I'm sure Ms. Farrow can speak to this, but while there are some ways to cross states in terms of identifying a driver that should be taken out of that driver's seat.
Now I want to get it all before my 5 minutes is up. But that's a classic thing that the Congress can do, so I thank you for that, Ms. Fulton. Dr. Poland?
Thank you for the question. The NTSB has long advocated for vehicle design aspects, dealing with crash prevention, stability control systems, forward collision avoidance, automatic emergency braking systems, occupant protection. Everyone has talked about lap shoulder belts, passenger lap shoulder belts, and then most recently talking about post-crash events, so fire protection to ensure
those are things that you think Congress, and only Congress can do.
Vehicle design aspects.
Yes.
We focus those recommendations to NHTSA.
Mr. Benish, because my time is going to run out.
I would say one of the things which I mentioned in my testimony is the STOP Act, illegal passing laws, and we do have a bill that's out there right now. And as I mentioned, most.
And you say that the federal government can do that?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm
Go
sorry.
ahead.
Well, like I said, the statistics, each day we figure there's at least 80,000 illegal passes.
Yeah, I'm just trying to get the
Yes.
priority. Ms. Farrow?
Yes, ma'am. In support of Chief Fulton's comment regarding oversight of drivers, resources and tools to ensure that states and companies have timely access to driver conviction, suspension, cancellation data.
Yeah, thank you. Secretary Condon?
Yeah, just one thing that we don't want to look for is there's a shortage of bus drivers generally across this country, and legislation that would eliminate or diminish the pool of drivers would be a detrimental issue when trying to find who's taking these children to school. But we agree that there should be a standardization. We think the bidding process needs to be adjusted where all schools can look at the safety aspects as opposed to accepting the lowest bid. And the other thing is we believe in, certainly with bus safety, but the standardization of the safety rules across the country so that every bidder is bidding the same.
Thank you very much, Secretary Condon. Those are very helpful suggestions as we prepare for the next bill. It sounds to me that the federal government is way behind giving those suggestions on things we could do. So I appreciate those suggestions, those recommendations from all of you. And I'm going to ask Mr. Davis, our ranking member, if he would offer his questions at this time.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks again to the witnesses. I enjoyed your opening testimony. Vic Zimmerman, he's the superintendent of Monticello School District in Piatt County, Illinois. And it's in my congressional district, and he's been active in ensuring children get safely to and from school. He's been particularly focused on the role technology can play in keeping our children safe when they exit the bus and cross the street. In fact, this past January, his school district purchased stop-arm cameras to report vehicles illegally passing a school bus. I know, though, that he doesn't want to stop there and is always looking for new technology to help keep his students and our kids safe. With that in mind, I want to start with Mr. Benish. With that in mind, are there existing technologies that we can better utilize to increase safety of children crossing the street in front of a stop bus?
Well, what we're looking at as right now is illegal passing laws, making sure that we look at not only the technology as far as radar. We discussed the other day that if there is a stop or bus or something with yellows on, just like you have a system where ambulances could go right through red lights when they make them turn green, a system where that would be hooked up to a bus that would talk to all the cars in the area, knowing that there's a slowing down or a stopped school bus. But we would also like to do creative public safety messaging, and we also would like to do more technology as far as training with the drivers.
Okay. Anybody else want to take that question? Technology, innovation?
Yeah,
Anything else?
I'll add to that. A little technology, it's available out there. You know, a little story real quick is I had a school bus driver with 4 first-grade boys, and he let 3 off at one stop and the 4th one at the following stop. One day, the mom picked up one of the boys to take home herself, so the bus driver's on his run. Instead of having 3 at one stop, he only had 2. But unbeknownst to him, the second stopped, and the other one-stop kid got off with the other 2. So he pulls up to the stop to let 3 boys off when he only had 2, and 3 get off. He goes to the following stop, and what does he find? He secures the vehicle, and the mom's waiting for her son to get off, and there's no child. Where's that child? The mom doesn't know, and the driver doesn't know that child got off at the previous stop. We have technology out there. We can scan a barcode in easily in any dimension, any store, anywhere. Why aren't we having a lanyard on a child or any child that scans it in when he gets on the bus, he scans it when he gets off the bus? Everybody knows where these children are. It's easy to check. It helps the drivers, it helps the parents, and it helps keep these kids safe. And if there was some kind of fatality accident, the first responders would certainly know how many children, boys and girls, and what their ages are on that bus, so they don't have to chase shadows when they get there.
Thank you very much. Excellent advice. Let's look at Ms. Farrell. Welcome back. Are there any existing barriers at the federal level that prevent states and local governments from adopting innovative safety solutions?
Ranking Member Davis, I'm trying to position that question in the context of AMVA to see what that would be in regard to. From the perspective of motor vehicle administrators and highway safety enforcement, they would be working closely on any national programs with the federal agency. And as I think Chief Fulton indicated, structuring a program at the state level. I'm not, are you speaking to a technology such as an employer notification system?
No, I've kind of gone beyond the technology issues, unless you have something else you want to add to my previous question. But I just want to know, I mean, you've had some experience sitting at that witness table before, and are there any barriers that you see at the federal level that would stop state and local governments from implementing some of the suggestions we just heard from Mr. Benish and Mr. Condron, or any other innovative approach?
Well, I really appreciate that question. I'm just not in a position to answer what would be a barrier at the federal level at this time.
How about you, Ms. Fulton?
Thank you, Ranking Member. We have not run into any barriers to strengthening the protections for our own kids other than what I mentioned, which is, keeping track of what happens interstate,
Okay.
Keeping track of drivers outside the state.
Well,
That's
you know what,
pretty
that's okay. I saved Mr. McLean for last, based upon who he's representing. What barriers do you think exist? Because clearly, we've seen the panel, others don't feel that there are any barriers to state and local legislatures and local officers being able to change and implement more safety standards.
I think one of the most significant barriers is money. And so when we enact bills at the local level, we're considering what local school districts and local cities and towns have for a budget. And so every time we put a requirement on local cities and towns, we have to incorporate any sort of fiscal impact. So that's a significant barrier at the state level that we have to consider when passing these laws.
All right, I'd ask you how we can fix it, but I'm out of time, so I'll yield back.
I must note that my very good friend, and he is my good friend, asked the very opposite of the question I asked, which is what the federal government can do, and he wants to know, is the federal government in the way? And it looks like there's more it can do than to get out of the way, at least at the moment. Mr. Garcia.
Thank you, Chairwoman Norton and Ranking Member Davis for organizing this hearing. As a father of three, I know how stressful it can be to worry about our children's safety, and I applaud the efforts of this committee to evaluate these safety measures today. Question for Ms. Poland. As you mentioned in your written testimony, an emergency braking system can serve to prevent and mitigate collisions. Earlier this year, I joined my colleague Hank Johnson from Georgia to introduce the Safe Roads Act to require commercial motor vehicles to be equipped with an automatic emergency brake or AEB system. In 2015, in an agreement with the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, or NHTSA, the NTSB recommended that all AEB come standard with all passenger vehicles to help mitigate and avoid collisions. Briefly, would you extend this same recommendation to school buses and or commercial motor vehicles as my legislation does?
The NTSB actually has recommended automatic emergency braking for commercial vehicles and school buses. Most recently, we recommended this technology for school buses in our Baltimore and Chattanooga Special Investigation Report. As you're emphasizing in the work that you're talking about, automatic emergency braking provides a protection in the last moments if there is a crash that is imminent, and provides that braking to mitigate the forces involved with the crash, and in some cases to avoid it. So again, the NTSB has been a long advocate for this type of technology.
Thank you. Just switching gears slightly, crash avoidance and mitigation technologies are critical to school bus safety. I'd like to transition, however, to a safety issue that is too often overlooked: the safety of the air our children breathe on school buses. I'm working with Senator Kamala Harris and colleague Jahana Hayes, a former educator from Connecticut, to introduce the Clean Bus Act to accelerate the electrification of the nation's bus fleet. Over 25 million school-age children rely on the nation's school bus fleet to get to and from school daily. The tailpipe emissions that they are exposed to in transit and while idling in these buses are extremely toxic, especially if some of these the school bus yards, are located in urban areas next to the residential areas. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the 2019 American Lung Association State of the Air Report, which further highlights the toxicity of air in heavy-duty diesel engines, including school buses.
So ordered.
Thank you. This pollution negatively affects school attendance, health, and test scores, a burden that also tends to fall disproportionately on low-income students and students of color, like those in the district I represent on Chicago's southwest and northwest sides. The Clean School Bus Act would provide grants to help states replace diesel buses with electric buses to reduce student exposure to tailpipe emissions and curb our contribution to the climate crisis. Question for Mr. McLean. As a former county commissioner and state legislator, I understand the struggles that states deal with to find funding for safety measures like these, do you believe that states and local governments would be supportive of additional federal grants to modernize and electrify the school bus fleet?
I do. I think that's a perfect example of one of the incentives that the federal government could use to provide increased safety measures for kids on school buses.
Great. And back to Ms. Poland, in your investigation of the Oakland bus fire, you noted that the school bus engine designs often fail to mitigate the spread of gases into the passenger compartment. That can exacerbate a situation involving a fire, but can you speak to whether or not these fumes can regularly enter into the passenger compartment, even in the absence of a fire?
Our investigation, of course, focused on the post-crash fire in that event, and when there was that significant fire in the engine compartment, how the incomplete firewall led to the fire being able to spread into the passenger compartment.
Can you comment on the entrance of fumes into the bus cavity?
The NTSB currently does not have a position on that aspect.
Okay, thank you. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Garcia. Mr. Gallagher.
Thank you. Ms. Poland, Rep. Krishnamurthy and I have introduced H.R. 2416, which is the Safe to Drive Act, which would direct the Department of Transportation to use some of the money that has already been appropriated for grants combating distracted driving to new grants for the same purpose, but which would be easier to qualify for. So my question is, to what extent does the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration see distracted driving, especially from cell phone use, as affecting the safety of school buses?
So the NTSB has commonly looked at distraction, and in fact, this has been an item on our most wanted list for many years. Distraction can come from a variety of different forms, and we focused on distraction for school bus drivers. So of course, in all the discussions that you're hearing today, we think that oversight of the drivers is critical, and that's dealing with the actions of the driver, including medical fitness and some of the many other aspects. But also there's technological solutions that if there is distraction involved, that we can mitigate the effects of a crash before they happen, or even make that crash less vulnerable to the occupants inside.
And as you look at the data of just crashes over, I mean, take your time period, has there been a consistent primary factor that has contributed to school bus crashes over the last several years? Or is each case just unique such that you can't establish a trend? Or is the sample size not large enough?
So the NTSB typically investigates extremely severe crashes that may not be representative of all crashes. But obviously, there's a wide variety of causes, and that's why we look at different recommendations to address those countermeasures. So you're hearing some of those today, from proper oversight of the drivers to technological interventions to also increasing the time to evacuate in post-crash events such as fires or water immersion.
And then final question for you, or really for anyone on the panel that wants to take a swing. I mean, to what extent do we think overall congestion on the roads, increasing congestion, which obviously would vary regionally, locally, is creating more safety concerns? So for example, I have a bill that would allow logging trucks access to highways so that to get them off local roads, which I view as not only an environmentally friendly thing, but a safety thing, right? I mean, this is sort of easier to transit than going around. We have a lot of roundabouts in Northeast Wisconsin, Green Bay, Wisconsin. We also know that according to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, getting on and off the bus, crossing the street, waiting for the bus can put children in significant danger. School buses operate on local roads, which include intersections, crosswalks, curves, stop signs, and other variations in the flow of traffic. So in your expert opinion, would reducing congestion in general, but specifically reducing sort of large vehicles like logging trucks from local roads improve the safety of school buses?
So school buses are large vehicles, and typically in most crashes with passenger vehicles, they fare very well. Unfortunately, in crashes with other large vehicles, that's where we see the vulnerabilities, especially in side impact collisions and the high-speed rollovers. We also have to be very careful of unintended consequences because the NTSB has investigated a number of commercial motor vehicle crashes, especially in work zones, where there may be some sort of a vehicle that isn't stopped for a queue that is developed for a work zone. So I guess I would encourage you to consider unintended consequences and also technological solutions, such as we were discussing earlier, of forward collision avoidance and automatic emergency braking for all commercial vehicles.
Interesting. Yes, ma'am.
Congressman, I would just add, and certainly NTSB is the expert on the statistics, but our tragic crash happened on a highway. So, you know, with a large vehicle striking a school bus on a highway, a major highway. So clearing the local roads wouldn't have been helpful in that situation. I think, again, unintended consequences, there are a lot of different ways to look at it.
Well, I certainly respect unintended consequences. It's probably the main reason I'm sitting on this side of the aisle. But I appreciate all of your answers, and thank you for the dedicated work that you do.
I'm sure it wasn't unintended that you're on that side of the aisle. Thank you very much, Mr. Gallagher. Mr. Malinowski.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Mr. Gallagher is always welcome to switch sides of the aisle, where we can talk afterwards.
Then I would have to not respect unintended consequences. Never mind. It's a question for a separate.
Ms. Fulton, first of all, welcome as a fellow New Jerseyan. Happy to see you here and very pleased to see the strides that New Jersey has been making in improving school bus safety going forward, especially after the tragic accident in Mount Olive, which happened in my district, as you know. I was able to meet Miranda's father and sister just a couple of weeks ago when they came to Washington to advocate for greater federal involvement in preventing tragedies like that bus crash from ever happening again. In that context, I wanted to ask you to say a little bit more about New Jersey's employer notification system. I think you began to a little bit earlier. As I understand, it was recently updated to better prevent bad drivers from getting behind the wheel of a bus. And I wonder if you could explain how the system works and some of the changes that we have made.
Yes, thank you, Congressman Malinowski. So we at Motor Vehicle, when a notice of suspension is posted by the courts or law enforcement to a driver's license, and that driver's license has a school bus endorsement, a report is automatically generated, and we do this on a daily basis, every business day, and for us, Saturday is a business day. So 6 days a week, we generate a report. Anyone who holds that school bus endorsement whose license has been suspended, and that goes directly to the Department of Ed. And then the Department of Ed was notifying operators. The change in the law, first, shortens the time that the employer has, and the Department of Education. So Department of Education has 24 hours to notify the operator, whether it's the Board of Ed or the private operator, that this driver has been suspended, and they must confirm within another 24 hours that that driver is off the road, that that driver is not driving a school bus. And the second piece of the legislation is that we don't just do that for suspensions or 12 points or over, which generates a suspension. We're now required to do that if you get 6 points or more, or 3 moving violations in a 3-year period. So there are more stringent requirements, and the notification has shortened. This is still relatively new, but that's how it works.
And so let's move from that to the across state lines issue. If somebody had an infraction, let's say someone had the equivalent of 6 points in another state, moved to New Jersey, what would happen? And how soon would it happen?
Well, first, Congressman, if there's a notice of suspension that comes from another state, we may get that any number of ways, depending on whether we have an agreement with that state where we get something electronically, or whether we get it in the mail the way that we communicate with some of our sister states. So it may come in the mail, and that can take time. It has to be managed manually. The 6 points, now that's a new Jersey rule, and we've not yet gotten that to happen automatically. right? So there's not an automatic trigger of 6 points that come in from another state. Now, I guess once it gets posted to the New Jersey driver license, then we're in state and we can manage it. But it's getting that, the real trick is getting notice from the other state. How long does it take for a conviction that happens in Pennsylvania or New York? How long does it take for that conviction to get posted in New Jersey? That's manual process many times.
So that just leads to the obvious final question, which is whether a national ENS, employer notification system, would be helpful to
A
you.
national notification system would be helpful for us, for sure. And, you know I've referenced AMVA before, but we actually use AMVA's existing system for other CDL information. So that does, that would be helpful.
Great, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Malinowski. It may be that there's something that this committee can do to make sure that that national system occurs, so I appreciate those questions. Mr. Palmer.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Ms. Poland, the NHTSA found that 97 pedestrians under the age of 18 were killed in school transportation-related crashes between 2008 and 2017. Do you know how many were struck by vehicles going around the bus out of that 97? The National Transportation Safety Board, does anyone have an idea?
So certainly there's data available on those crash statistics. The NTSB accidents are a portion of those numbers that you're looking at. And as I mentioned in my opening statement, we have 3 ongoing investigations in 3 different states where we're looking at what's happening on those high-speed roadways.
I've got several questions that I want to ask about this, but I think it's important to know how many of these fatalities were the result of people going around the bus as opposed to the bus actually running over the child. You've got both those situations. And the reason I bring that up is that in reading the testimonies here, Mr. Benish testimony pointed out that the passing of stopped school buses during loading or unloading illegal in all 50 states has reached epidemic proportions. In most recent annual observational survey in 2018, 105,306 school bus drivers in 38 states reported almost 84,000 vehicles illegally passed their stopped school bus in one day. That is incomprehensible to me that many people are that stupid, are that unconcerned about the safety of the kids on that bus. And based on the observations, if you projected that out over a 180-day school year, that's 15 million vehicles illegally passing a school bus. So I think it's important to know, Madam Chairman, how many of these fatalities or injuries are because people are passing the school bus. And I think we may need to take a look, particularly at the state level, for those of you who are involved with the state legislature, as the Honorable Ms. Fulton and Mr. McLean, that the penalties ought to be much more severe for going around a school bus when it's stopped. So that I think it would be important to know, what's going on with that. And the other thing that I want to ask is that a number of these accidents are in rural areas. Any idea, Ms. Poland, about why so many of them in rural areas? We had a lot of discussion about congested streets. That's really not an issue out where I grew up. And I rode a school bus when I was a kid, bus 64, by the way.
Well, I guess it's unfortunate to report that the National Association of State Directors of Pupil Transportation yesterday put out the new statistics for the last school year, and now they're reporting that there's over 95,000 illegal passings in that single day from 39 states that are reporting that information. As I mentioned earlier, the NTSB is looking at 3 crashes. All of those are in what you would classify as rural areas. They're on high-speed roadways, 55-mile-per-hour roadways. And so our investigators are currently looking at a variety of different countermeasures, including conspicuity, route planning, and technological countermeasures to be able to make recommendations to our board to assist in this process.
I want to get to some questions that will lead to some solutions, okay? So what I'm suggesting here is that we look at these crash statistics, rural versus suburban, urban. Look at the number of vehicles that are going around school buses. I'd like to know whether or not these are rural incidents or in other areas. In regard to these higher speed highways, where I currently live, we have a highway where it's 55, but during the certain times of day when kids are coming to school and when kids are leaving the school, that speed limit is reduced to about 25 miles an hour. And it may be that and particularly in rural areas, you treat this like you would a construction zone. Somebody brought this up, Madam Chairman. I think it's a pretty good idea that maybe during those times, we do it like a construction zone. We notify you ahead of time, you've got to bring your speed down, and because you've got school buses operating in the area. I know that's going to create some issues for transport vehicles and things like that, but I'll pay the extra cost for a loaf of bread or a bottle of water, whatever, if it saves the life of a kid. One last thing, if I may, Madam Chairman, I'm kind of on a roll. If I can look at this too, and this is something that I wanted to ask Mr. McLean about, the legislative role in this, and for Ms. Fulton too. My concern is about the abuse of alcohol, and some states have requirements for, how many hours after a bus driver consumes alcohol. That should also include recreational marijuana. And the thing that concerns me is that there are commercial drivers who lose their license, and in a lot of cases they self-report. And I think we need to have a database where if someone applies for a license to drive a school bus, there's a database that is searchable, and you can determine whether or not someone has lost their license before we put them behind the wheel of a bus carrying our kids. What do you think about that? I don't know that I want to make it a federal law, but...
He's over time, so I wish you'd take those suggestions under advisement.
I thank the chairman for her indulgence. I yield back.
And I thank Mr. Palmer for his comments, especially this notion about ways to make the penalties more severe for passing by a school bus. That's something that we need to look into, raising a federal issue as to whether or not we could do that, recognizing that most of these laws are local. And Mr. Palmer raised a number of issues. I think this was raised before about studies that we need to do, statistics we simply do not have. It seems to me we cannot pass another bill without making sure that those studies are not, and statistics are not mandated. So I thank you, Mr. Palmer. Mr. Cohen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First, I'd like to address my question to Ms. Fulton. Thank you for the good work you've done in New Jersey. Y'all seem to have been way ahead of the game, done super. Why has New Jersey been able to make significant progress toward improving school bus safety, the 3-point safety belts, when it's been so difficult in other states?
Well, Congressman, I will be honest with you. It makes a difference when the governor and the members of our New Jersey congressional delegation make it a priority, continue to work actively, educating the community, speaking out about it, and speaking to our state legislators. We've had incredible support across the board from members of Congress and and the governor to say we're going to do this. Governor Phil Murphy, and this has been something that was important to him and important to our members of Congress, and they made it happen. Listen, no one wants to wait for a tragedy, but when it happens, that's an opportunity where people in a position to make a difference can choose to really.
Were you part of the campaign to make it happen, the lobbying effort?
I was not. I don't lobby for legislation. In my position as motor vehicle commissioner, we provided
As an observer, do you recall who were the main people against the bills?
against the bill.
Yeah, was it?
There wasn't significant opposition. There was, there were questions about the additional cost, but the additional cost of a couple thousand on a 54-passenger bus is it's a cost for school districts, but there was a lot of support from the school districts where they'd had accidents to go forward with it.
Thank you, ma'am. Ms. Poland, let me ask you, as part of a special report examining school bus safety, the NTSB clearly and unequivocally recommended that all new large school buses be equipped with lap and shoulder belts. You probably remember that from my opening statement. I'm sure everybody does. It's probably enshrined in everybody's mind. In addition, the American Academy of Pediatrics has a longstanding position that new school buses should be equipped with seat belts. Why is it so important that this common sense safety equipment that has already saved thousands of lives in passenger motor vehicles be placed in all large school buses?
As I mentioned in my opening statement, we know that school buses are extremely safe, but they're vulnerable in certain types of crashes. And over again, we're seeing children that are injured and killed in these types of very severe crashes. The technologies have changed over time. We initially recommended occupant protection systems, but now we're seeing that lap shoulder belts are well designed. And in fact, in certain circumstances, we're able to study how they're performing in crashes and finding that occupants are very well protected in these new designs of lap shoulder belts. So that's why we came out with our recommendations to the states to have new large school buses be equipped with passenger lap shoulder belts.
I kind of vaguely recall from when I sponsored this as a state senator, which is like 20-odd years ago maybe, that there was some discussion that if they have the safety belts, that the seats are like perpendicular, they're right angles, and that they're stiff and they don't move, and that it would hurt the kids' necks if they were strapped in. Is that an argument that's been made?
That is an argument that's been made, but fortunately, the technologies have advanced so they're able to protect an occupant that may be unbelted behind occupants that are belted as well. And again, we've been able to study some of these crashes when there have been onboard video camera systems that have shown the outcome and seen that there is good protection with these modern lap shoulder belts in school buses.
Thank you. The NTSB also recommended automatic emergency braking technology. It's widely available. You also concur that that should be part of a school bus?
Correct. So the NTSB is always advocating for crash prevention. So technologies like forward collision avoidance, automatic emergency braking, electronic stability control, if they can activate at that last moment before a crash happens, in some cases we can avoid the crash altogether. In other cases, we can just lower the severity of that crash. But it's very important for school buses as well as all vehicles.
Thank you. And those are the reasons which have been discussed here while Senator Duckworth and I introduced H.R. 3959, the School Bus Safety Act, and we hope that we can have it included in some measure as time goes on and pass it into law. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Cohen. I allowed Mr. Palmer to ask a question when he was slightly out of time, but it was impossible, given the time remaining, for the question to be answered. So I invite those of you who do have answers to Mr. Palmer's question to submit it in writing, and I will make sure that those answers get into the record. Mr. Balderson.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I will assist that because Mr. Palmer, Representative Palmer, took some of my question, that talking about rural communities and the impact of bus travel for those students. And I did have a stat here that 52% of the school bus crashes do occur in rural communities, and that is done by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. That was done. Could all of you elaborate onto some of the things of any recommendations that we can do to improve bus safety in rural communities? And some of the areas that I represent in rural, in Ohio 12th District, is literally, I mean, there's one county that's not in the district anymore, but right close, that has no 4-lane roads. So it's all state route or gravel roads. And a student is on that bus one way 2 to 2.5 hours for travel. So I'll ask the whole panel if there's any thoughts that you would have of safety concerns that have been addressed for the rural communities since 52% of the school bus incidents happen in rural communities. The Honorable McLean, lead the way.
I'm not sure I'm in a position to say what would help rural communities specifically. So I don't know that I have suggestions for rural communities, but I do think that allowing states to explore the solutions and having the federal government permit the states to explore those solutions is really important to figure out what the best solutions are. You know, we're probably never going to eliminate all accidents, but we need to figure out the best ways to reduce the number of accidents. So I don't have specific recommendations for rural
Does
areas.
anybody have a suggestion? Honorable Fulton.
Congressman, I don't know that this is specific to rural communities, but in our state, rural and urban communities both may have less resources at their school board than the suburban communities. Sorry. But one of the things that's critically important for us is the inspection from the state level of the school bus to ensure that they're not allowing a lack of resources to lead to the school buses not staying maintained and not meeting the standards. And just as important, when we do those inspections, both the announced and the unannounced, we check the driver records. Are you sure that the drivers that you're putting behind the wheel, does every one of them have a current medical certification? Does every one of them have a current CDL with a legitimate endorsement and no suspensions? You'd be surprised how often private operators that are often used when funds run low, private operators have been, we had 330 summonses in the space of 1 year in our inspections where private operators, for the most part it was private, operators had failed to keep those things current, and that leads to people being behind the wheel that aren't qualified.
Madam Chairman, I'll switch gears for the panel a little bit. According to the National Highway Safety Administration, the greatest risk to school children is getting on and off the school bus. Have any states successfully implemented reforms to better prevent these violations? And Mr. Cordorm, you can lead.
I was just going to comment on the last question on the rural
You may-
bus
you may-
driver, if
you
I
may
jump
comment.
back on that question. Traditionally, on the coast, the east and west coast, you don't see it as much, but in the rural area, you see more. They call it park out, where the driver takes the bus home with them. They don't report to a terminal or a yard. The driver just gets in the bus and then goes on the route. So in the rural areas, I think you probably would need to make sure that those vehicles are inspected and up to date, a little more oversight, and also that the driver's current in their training on what's current in that area.
Okay.
I would like to comment, being one of the bus drivers, and I do drive a bus and have had CDL and driven for over 25 years, that I think what Mr. Palmer said also too is more signage in those areas, or especially rural, making sure we put specific speed limits down at certain times of the day to slow down, just so we do as a construction site and to slow down. And again, as I mentioned in my opening statement, we do have a new act out, the Stop for School Bus Act of 2019 by Senator Worlarski. And again, we want more public messaging, especially for new drivers, and especially more talk about distracted driving, which was involved with an accident in Rochester, where exactly what happened. 3 students were killed this past year in rural Indiana, all from the same family early in the morning.
Okay. Thank you. Madam Chair, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Balderson. Mr. Payne.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Ms. Fulton, it's good to have you here. I don't know if you're aware of this, probably not, but before my time in Congress and the president of the City Council in Newark, New Jersey, I was in student transportation for 10 years. I started out actually for one of the educational commissions, Essex County Educational Services Commission, and started out as a school bus monitor where I was out on routes in the morning doing spot inspections and making sure parents that had problems, children being picked up, all those type of issues, and worked my way up to supervisor of transportation, where I was responsible for 10,000 children on school buses a day, handling Newark Public Schools transportation and special needs throughout Essex County. Our most vulnerable students, stretcher-bound, children that were paraplegic. This is really where I cut my teeth in public service. So I'm really glad to see that we're here discussing these issues, and also I'm proud that New Jersey is on the cutting edge of safety. And I fully understand the need for safe school buses and commend you for your work to increase their safety. My children, I have triplets, and in New Jersey they have early school intervention where children go to school as early as 3. And so my children were on school buses in Newark at 3 years old. As a matter of fact, there's one of them taking pictures of me right now. So he's made it pretty far. So New Jersey is the leader when it comes to school bus safety, requiring all school buses to have the 3-point safety belts. Yet the federal government does not require that all school buses have them. Can you explain how the 3-point safety belts improve bus safety? And do you think it would be in the country's best interest to have these belts required nationwide?
Thank you, Congressman Payne, and if I might use a moment to say, I didn't get a chance to agree with my friend Mr. Condren from the Teamsters, but school bus drivers are incredibly valuable and incredibly underpaid for the responsibility that we give them.
I agree.
So let me say that. And
I
then
concur.
with that, in terms of the statistics on 3-point belts, we get all our stats from the National Transportation Safety Board. So to make sure I don't screw that up, I'm going to pass off to Ms. Bullen and defer to her for the information on that.
So the NTSB has looked at a wide variety of crashes. I've investigated crashes in school buses for over 20 years now, looking at how school bus passengers, what happens during crashes when they're just compartmentalization inside the school bus, when it's lap-only belts, and when they're lap shoulder belts. And we've found that the recent advancements in the design of the lap shoulder belts has provided excellent protection for the occupants inside the school bus in a variety of different crashes, knowing that the baseline level, the minimum performance for large school buses right now, compartmentalization is incomplete. And many of these catastrophic crashes involve side impacts and rollovers, which lap shoulder belts provide that protection for our occupants.
And I'd like to ask, I also was able to meet with Miranda's father and her family several weeks ago. And I am wondering, the laws that we have in New Jersey, are they really a good foundation for the possibility of federal laws across the country? And anybody that wants to weigh in, please, feel free.
Well, Congressman, we already have the laws, and I feel, perhaps my friend from Maine can weigh in on whether the states feel, that we still are learning in
Right.
terms of how to execute some of these things and what's going to have the greatest impact. But we'll see what
Okay.
others.
Yes or no from anybody that wants to, because my time is running out.
And it's the position of NCSL that the federal government should leave it to the states to explore different solutions, because different solutions work. There are different solutions for each state.
And speaking with a variety of people that have implemented the lap shoulder belts in various jurisdictions, we're pleased to see that best practices are being shared amongst this community, because I think we're all in agreement here that ultimately we want the safe transportation of our students to
Okay.
and from school.
Thank you. My time has expired. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Payne. Mr. Stauber.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the witnesses giving us the opportunity to listen to your expertise. I come from a little bit different background. I was actually a school bus monitor many years ago, But I also had the privilege of serving my community in Duluth, Minnesota as a police officer. One of the worst things we can do is respond to a crash of a student getting on or off the bus. And it's unconscionable that we see drivers do this every single day in this country. It's uncalled for. I have been in a fully marked squad car, the second car behind a stopped school bus, the lights on, the gates out, right in front of me. That's unconscionable. And so for me, to see it, I've cited it, I've testified in it in court. For me, we are in this together. When we put our kids at the end of the sidewalk or the corner, we expect them to arrive safe to and from school. And from my perspective, I look at, we talked about the greatest concern is the crossing of the roads. Are we putting enough emphasis in our driver's education classes in each of our states? Because they're all a bit different. Mr. McLean, what does your state require for driver's education, total hours, and what do they put for this subject, or don't they specify this subject?
Well, I'm not a motor vehicle administrator, so I can't speak to the exact requirements, but we do have a pretty rigorous system and process for getting a license.
No, you're talking about 16-year-old drivers going through the driver's education. Is there anybody that thinks that we could enhance our driver's education? Because if the majority of it's happening, drivers not paying attention or what have you, it seems to me the educational component and the seriousness of teaching our young drivers. Mr. Benish.
Yes, that's something, again, with the STOP Act that we have proposed in my opening statement about putting more education. I recently had this discussion with my 3 teens about 2 months ago about stopping in and around a school bus. And knowing that I own one of a school bus company and I'm a driver, it was very interesting to hear their perspective from Mackenzie, George, and Jack, what they did know and did not know about stopping around a school bus, who they're brand new drivers, and it was just plain scary.
Yeah, and I think that we have to actually, allow our states to adopt real strict educational parts of stopping in and around school buses. And by the way, I am a co-sponsor of the Stop for School Buses Act.
Thank
for
you.
For me, one driver driving around a school bus is too much. One in this entire country, because the safety of our kids is paramount. One of the things I wanted to talk about, Ms. Poland, you talk about, the restraints and what have you. Do you feel comfortable saying that the restraints in a fire or water emergency for young kids, do you feel, like, especially in rural areas where you're not going to get the help right away, do you feel comfortable in putting that mandate forth to the entire country?
That's a good question, and many people, of course, are asking that question. I can just lend some of the experience that we've had where we've looked at crashes, very severe crashes where there's been onboard camera systems, and we've studied the evacuation and seen that the passengers that have maintained consciousness during the crash are able to self-evacuate. So it's important for those students to be protected during the crash to give them the best chance to be able to self-evacuate. If they are unable to be protected during that crash, then of course the injuries may negatively affect their ability to quickly and safely evacuate the school bus.
Thank you very much. And to the witnesses, I really appreciate, we all want the school bus to, and the kids and their safety. That's the utmost importance. And you all are experts in your respective fields, so I appreciate this opportunity to listen to you. And together, we can increase, in my mind, we can increase this safety exponentially using, I think, some common sense measures. So with that, I'll yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stauber. Mr. Babin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate it. And thank you, witnesses, for your expertise. Appreciate you being here. Mrs. Poland, thank you for being here with us today. Each and every member of this committee cares deeply about the safety and the security of our school-age children, as we've heard numerous of our members say. And we want to ensure that when they do get on a school bus to go to and from school, that they arrive safely at their destination. However, I also want to make sure that our states and local communities are allowed the flexibility they need to implement proper regulations for their unique jurisdictions. And with that in mind, how can Congress balance the need for improved school bus safety without imposing a heavy-handed, over-regulated, one-size-fits-all approach for our states and school districts?
Thank you for the question. The NTSB has made recommendations about vehicle design, and we think it's important for the federal government to provide that minimum level of vehicle design, including the crash protection and occupant protection. We've investigated many crashes where oversight of the drivers is a concern. We recognize that there's minimum standards at the federal level, but much of that oversight happens at the state and local level. And so many of our recommendations have focused on that state and local level. So again, we think that those minimum standards should be provided at the federal level, but we do think it's important and critical that the state and local levels can implement them and in many times exceed them, as you've heard today.
Exactly. I have a niece that was involved in an accident in Beaumont, Texas, a chartered bus, not a school bus, and it was a terrible accident with some fatalities, and my niece was injured. And I think they've implemented in the state of Texas seat belts because of that one accident. And then to follow up on that question, could you talk about some of the recent actions that you've seen states and school districts take in order to increase the safety of students traveling to and from school on school buses? I know we've talked about that already. You've already hit on it a little bit, but if you would elaborate a little further, I would appreciate it.
Yes, of course. So we're very pleased to see so much movement on occupant protection. There are so many states that are now looking at passenger lap shoulder belts for large school buses, and we think that this is a critical move. We're also seeing a lot of motion in the school bus manufacturers, where they're looking at some of the technologies for preventing crashes, and they're implementing these in some buses as standard equipment. So we also think that that's also very critical for the crash avoidance aspect. So there's a lot of movement. We're seeing a lot of sharing of best practices, including some of the aspects that don't necessarily address injuries and fatalities, but some of the aspects of driver retention and distraction that may be improved with some of the technologies and some of the installations that we're talking about, like lap shoulder belts.
Absolutely. I will yield back the balance of my time. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Babin. Mr. LaMalfa?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Actually got a little bit of good news on this subject here. We have in Northern California, the town of Paradise, which had a horrendous fire, almost coming up on a year ago now. And we had one story, a local school bus driver, Kevin McKay, who during this fire crisis, without being told by anyone, decided to drive his school bus back into town to the Ponderosa Elementary School in Paradise when the Camp Fire hit town. His wife and family were already on their way to safety. In coordination with the Ponderosa school's principal, Mr. McKay loaded 22 kids and several teachers onto his bus and took them to safety. At one point, Mr. McKay literally tore off his own shirt and gave it to the teachers, who ripped it up and made it into breathing masks because the bus was filling up with the smoke from the fire. So thanks to the efforts of Mr. McKay and other Ponderosa teachers, all the kids escaped the campfire without major injury. So, a really good piece. Now, being California, as dangerous as the wildfires are there and still will be, school buses are under fire in another way. The California Air Resources Board, over the objections of heavy vehicle users, decided to implement the installation of the diesel particulate filters, refitting these existing buses with these devices. They can reach and exceed 600 degrees Celsius when the engine is operating and have been prone to clogging with ash and unburned fuel, which causes them to catch fire. These are not isolated cases to buses, or we have plenty of anecdotes with trucks and other vehicles that have been forced to be refitted with these devices. Just like freight trucks, again, school buses are vulnerable to these issues and have caught on fire. Now, being California is the largest population, it also has the largest school bus fleet and also the largest number of students of any state. So California usually has the most restrictive regulations on school buses as well, it does. So CHP has to inspect each bus every year, and the drivers themselves review their own vehicles every 45 days. So despite these regs, these buses still catch on fire because the diesel particulate filter that was required was not suitable to be used. That technology hadn't caught up to what was the requirement on these buses. Hundreds of thousands of vehicles were required to install them anyway, no matter the cost. So I'll throw this to Ms. Poland. The federal government does set a pretty low bar for school buses and typically allows states to increase those standards as they see fit. Are you aware of any intervention the federal government has made when states are endangering students and implementing standards that are causing school buses to catch fire?
Our experiences with the school bus fires are not related to the issue that you're bringing up, but some of the countermeasures that we've recommended may
You have not
also
heard of
be-
any case of trucks or buses that have been refitted with these filter systems of catching fire?
So our Oakland, Iowa crash that we just made public recently had a school bus fire, but in that case, the engine compartment caught on fire from overheating of the turbocharger. Of course, in that case, I also mentioned that there was an incomplete firewall that allowed the smoke and fumes and
Well,
fire.
that's one case there. Now, a turbo that has, a turbo that was coming apart or lost a bearing or whatever, that could be something that would happen. But we're talking about the diesel particulate filters that have been forced to be refitted to many buses and trucks and lots of equipment in California and maybe other states that have joined in that. So is there any kind of protection from the federal government over a regulation that is causing fires simply by the fitting of this equipment?
The NTSB's position is on fire suppression systems in the engine compartment and also on flammability of the interior components. It wouldn't address specifically the cause of your fire, but may mitigate the consequences and increase the time for passengers to be evacuated if those systems were fitted with those countermeasures.
Well, the federal EPA is taking a look at how states sometimes go beyond to the harm of consumers, to the harm of the safety of buses on that. Would NTSB be looking more at the possible harm in this case, that fitting these devices on, untested, the technology not having been made fully applicable in a safety factor? Would they look at saying maybe that these should not be fitted until they're more properly engineered?
If there was a circumstance where that was the cause of a fire that the NTSB is investigating, I'm confident that we would look into that and certainly address countermeasures that may be able to mitigate the consequences.
You might be able to look at countermeasures. So you have no statistics on how many fires have been caused by the refitting of these vehicles with these filters?
No, sir, we don't.
Have you actually heard of it? Have you heard of this happening, anecdotally yourself?
As I mentioned earlier, that has not been the cause of any of our school bus fires nor our motor coach fires.
In general, trucks, buses, diesel vehicles that have had these filters refitted to them.
Not that specific issue.
You never heard of that?
Gentleman's time has expired.
Never heard of that?
Mr. Katko.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. I'll say at the outset, I'm a very proud sponsor of the Stop for School Buses Act of 2019, and I'm pleased that this legislation includes a review of technologies to enhance school bus safety, so I'm very happy with that. Mr. Condren, I just want to congratulate you on last night's vote. It's very important for Teamsters, and I was very supportive of that as well. So let's hope that moves in the Senate. That's a very big vote. Something you said, and I believe Ms. Poland said it, the most recent studies that 95,000 people pass school buses with lights on illegally a day now. That's the most recent study. That is really stunning to me. And one of the things that the Stop for School Bus Act of 2019 includes is a review of technologies to enhance school bus safety. I'm exposed to some of these in different settings with law enforcement. I was a federal organized crime prosecutor for 20 years, so I'm aware of all the emergent technologies. Let's talk about a few of them. I think there's some technologies out there that would pay for themselves. And if you let me indulge me for a second. For example, if there's something mounted outside the bus which shows, can take a picture of the car and its license plate as it's passing, and then they're subsequently fined, and you got 95,000 cars doing this a day, those very quickly pay for themselves. So I don't know if that's something that you're contemplating, but something that is going to absolutely get to the distracted driver, because I think that's a big part of it, and something that absolutely gets to the lack of respect for these warning signs. And I think we need to take the gloves off with these knuckleheads that are doing this, because one of my recent statistics showed in a 10-year study or whatever it was that 90-some-odd children were killed as pedestrians, not on the bus, and different accidents, and getting off a bus or getting on, as you have noted, is the most dangerous time. So I'd like to hear what you think about that possible proposal. I know it's being used in other applications to, for example, there's technology out there that as a car goes by, you take a quick picture of it and you can tell right away whether its registration's expired or not, and they get sent a ticket. I mean, why can't we do something similar with buses? And if we had that, I think it would pay for itself. So I'd like to hear from you and some of the others.
So the NTSB has looked at some aspects revolving around the school bus loading zone, including the route selection, in order to minimize the exposure in these circumstances, and also conspicuity. We have 3 investigations that are ongoing right now where we're exploring a variety of these technologies that can aid in the loading zone in preventing or mitigating these injuries and fatalities. Our investigators are looking at a variety of different aspects, and I guess I will open it up to some of our state partners here at the table, because we're also exploring that there may be some barriers at the state level for some of the technological interventions that you're talking about.
There may be, but I know some of these technological innovations have gone into practice, and I think it can't go unnoticed that the distracted driver component is quite serious, and it seems to be getting much worse. So statistics up until your updated ones today had it in the 60-something thousand per day. Now it's at 95,000. That's a gigantic increase in a short period of time, and that is indicative of an escalation of the distracted driver or the person who just disregards it. And I think it's time to take the gloves off with them. So I'd like to hear from Mr. Bennett. You want to add anything?
Well, and we can get you a state-by-state school bus illegal passing law breakdown. And some states do have and have enacted taking the picture of license and so on, and some states have made it more severe. Unfortunately, as you just mentioned, taking the gloves off is needed because it's just not preventing them to do that. So again, with the STOP Act, and we appreciate the support, we need more signage, we need more education for new young drivers, and obviously distracting driving is a huge problem, especially in trucking and in school busing, as that's where we see now obviously more accidents on the road, and that's definitely got something to do with it. But we have to make it a lot more severe, and we have to do a lot better job making it our presence known about stopping for school buses.
Yeah, I understand that there's a lot of other components. I'm just focusing really on the stop school bus. That's an epidemic when you have that many cars a day disregarding it or not seeing it. So anybody else want to add anything to that? Mr. McLean.
Yes, thank you very much. Just very briefly, so we just enacted a bill to allow cities and towns to put stop arm cameras on their school buses. We believe that this is a really critical issue because it goes to the enforcement. Our state police believe that increased fines don't actually solve the problem, but the enforcement does, and the stop arm cameras will allow the prosecution of violators of that law.
Right, I guess that's what I'm talking about. I mean, not increasing fines as much as saying every single person that passes, you're going to get a picture of the license plate, and they're going to get smacked.
Correct.
That might help. So, thank you very much. I'll yield back, Madam.
Thank you, Mr. Ketko. Ms. Miller.
Thank you, Chairwoman Norton and Ranking Member Katko, and thank you all for being here today. I'm happy we can come here today to talk about solutions to address the school bus safety. I'm a mother and a grandmother, and I'd like to say that safety of children is of the utmost importance and should be our first priority with our kids. Dr. Poland, do you know what percentage of school bus crashes are classified as large buses?
I don't have the specific statistic, but the majority of school buses that are on our roads today are classified as large school buses.
Okay. In Charleston, West Virginia, one of our school districts held a demonstration on a new safety lighting system that illuminates the paths students take to the bus in the dark. It's been extremely helpful to the students and other drivers on the road. Have you noticed a trend in the amount of off-the-bus accidents at night?
It's been a long-standing trend that more students are injured and killed in the loading zone than on the bus itself. Of course, we know that school bus operation changes throughout the year, so sometimes it's in low light conditions. And of course, with these crashes that we're looking at in the 3 states that I mentioned earlier, 55-mile-per-hour roads, low light conditions, there's a variety of countermeasures that our investigators are looking at, and we're looking forward to bringing those recommendations to our board in the near future.
Is there anything that you think Congress can do to work on this issue?
I think there's a variety of aspects, and certainly having this hearing is one of them, because our state partners have a variety of countermeasures that they're already implementing. And so we're looking to those successful cases when we're investigating these types of crashes to see what the best practices are and what are proven technologies to be able to reduce the injuries and fatalities in the school bus loading zone.
Have a more consistent view. In 2010, I was in our state legislature, and a grandmother came to me and my office mate. Her 6-year-old granddaughter had been killed, run over, getting off a school bus. And of course, she was heartbroken. And it took us quite a while to get legislation through to at least double the fines. And it's been an ongoing thing to try and change the laws as they go. But the heartache, and I mean, we've developed quite a strong relationship with this grandmother through it all, and the little girl would be turning 16 now. It just breaks your heart. And I know one of the biggest problems that we have in school bus safety is the people who are ignoring the school bus unloading stop lights. Currently, Indiana has taken measures to address the placement of school buses that are operated on a U.S. route or state route. From my understanding, the driver may not load or unload a student at a location that requires the student to cross a roadway unless no other safe alternatives are available. Have you all seen other states take steps to improve unloading safety? Any of you all? Mr. McLean?
Repeat the question.
Okay. On state routes, the state of Indiana has issued a law that you cannot load or unload a student at a location on a 55-mile-an-hour highway unless they have to cross it unless there's no other alternative.
We haven't, I don't know any specific issues around routing. Really, we've been dealing with issues on and around the loading and unloading zone.
But never across a highway where they have to cross over.
Not that I know of.
Because I know in driving myself, when I see a school bus on this side of the road, and it's a 2 lanes over here and 2 lanes over here and stuff in the middle, and they're stopped, a lot of people just keep going here, and it's extremely difficult to get that child across the road. Have there been any other best practices implemented to keep kids safe in loading and unloading zones, particularly in those unsafe traffic areas and dangerous neighborhoods? Mr. Benish?
Dangerous neighborhoods, yes, they started to, especially in the city of Chicago, they do have certain areas where they have chaperones and or people in the neighborhood that'll help out with that. But getting back to your original question and suggestions, according to what I heard from the state of California, the driver has to physically walk off the bus with the student, with the sign, and walk them to the side of the street in that instance. And I guess over the past 30 or 40 years has been very successful, and they've had a really good low frequency of accidents with that.
So they don't have like a helper on the bus that would get off and do it?
It's actually the driver, according to
Wow.
what I've heard.
Okay, thank you. I yield back my time.
Thank you very much, Ms. Miller. Mr. Westerman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for your testimony today. I live in a large rural district back in Arkansas where bus transportation is a big issue. I had the opportunity to serve on a school board, was the first elected office that I held. Then in the state legislature, where we dealt with a lot of school-related policy. As we look at the impacts of what we do with bus safety and bus transportation, it, I think, probably has a disproportional impact on rural schools because so much of their budgets go to transportation with the longer routes and the additional buses that they have that sometimes aren't fully utilized. Mr. Benish, I think you mentioned something about cost, and I might have heard, I think Mr. Condren mentioned something about cost effectiveness, and obviously when we're talking about school buses, safety outweighs cost, but cost has to be a consideration because schools just don't have the funding to go out and purchase all of the latest and greatest equipment that's there. One thing, and the gentleman asked questions earlier about air quality, and I know that there's some really clean bus technology out there, not electric buses, but compressed natural gas buses. And an issue that I saw with that from the local level and on the state level was a lot of schools would really like to put in CNG buses, and the cost of a new CNG bus is equivalent to the cost of a new diesel bus, but you have to have this elaborate CNG charging station that is a large capital investment for schools, so they often can't afford the upfront capital investment so that they can take advantage of the low operating cost with CNG buses. This is, 10 or 12 years ago when I was working on these issues. What's the safety, as far as compressed natural gas versus diesel or conventional gasoline buses? Are there differences in the safety in a crash test or with air quality?
CNG buses were introduced about 10 years ago and really just never caught popularity due to exactly what you're saying as far as the cost. They're quite expensive, and the fueling stations I've heard run anywhere from $200,000 to $300,000. There has to be with compressed natural gas, which we did run some of this in the 70s, and you do have to make some modifications to your shop and to your yard due to the explosiveness, obviously, of the gas. The new diesel engines that are out there today are actually pretty clean. So somebody told me the other day that the air coming out or coming into a diesel or coming out of a diesel is cleaner now than it is coming in. So there has been a lot of cleanup. You don't see a big puff of black smoke anymore in yellow school buses. We also run some propane buses at home, and we have 2 electric school buses on order, which we should get sometime this fall. So there is technology that's out there, but as far as the air quality inside the bus and as far as the diesel emissions, there's been some DERA funding that's out there that's gotten a lot of those older buses off the road. So it is effective, and the buses today are definitely way cleaner than they were 10 years ago.
And so when I was going back to the school board, we would purchase a few buses every year and kind of rotate new buses through the fleet. So after a while, you get older buses that don't have the latest technology on it. As kind of advice to schools, is it better to wait and spend more money on the new bus with the latest safety gear, or to invest that money in your old equipment, putting the safety gear onto it?
That's probably like a bus-by-bus feature. What we talked about today is stability control is going to be standard pretty much in all school buses. Emergency braking and those kind of things, technology is right in the forefront and should be on most school buses in the very near future. So I guess if you can afford it and for the safety of the children and the newer bus, it'd probably make a better practice to buy a newer bus nowadays.
And you were talking about the tremendous amount of passes of stopped school buses. How do we educate the public more to know, when there's a bus stopped with the lights flashing and the arm out, that means stop. And I say that just from practical experience. Within the last couple of months, I was driving on a road in my district. It was a very wide, nice road, 2 lanes of traffic each direction with a turning lane in the middle, 65-mile-an-hour speed limit. And I started meeting a school bus on the far side of the road, slowing down to stop. So I stopped in a 65-mile-an-hour zone, and I think I got passed 4 times. And the kids were getting off on the other side of the road. It wasn't necessarily any danger for those children who were getting off on the other side of the road, but still, people just ignored that stop school bus. And plus, it was kind of a safety issue with me stopped in a 65-mile-an-hour zone with cars coming up behind me real quickly. So how do we educate the public and do a better job of that? Because it's basically just on when you take your driver's test.
Someone can answer, but the time has expired. Is there any answer?
So the NTSB is focusing on route selection, and then with our continuing investigations, we're looking at other countermeasures because 3 of our investigations are very similar to that circumstance, except the students were crossing the high-speed oncoming roadway. And so we're looking at countermeasures to try and address that issue specifically.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Westerman, and I want to welcome Chairman Cummings, who asked permission to sit with us at this hearing and ask questions. Mr. Cummings.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. On January 11, 2017, Congressman Steve Cohen, our former colleague, and our former colleague, Congressman Jimmy Duncan, and I wrote to our previous chairman asking that the committee convene a hearing on school bus safety, but he did not answer our request. I want to thank Chairwoman Norton and Chairman DeFazio for your focus on this critical issue and for convening today's hearing. On November 1st, 2016, 6 people were killed in Baltimore, in my hometown, when a school bus crashed into a car, then struck a pillar in a cemetery, and finally collided head-on with a public transit bus. The National Transportation Safety Board investigated this crash and a crash in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and adopted a report on May 22nd, 2018, addressing these 2 accidents. The report stated, and I quote, "Although the specific safety issues differed, the crashes shared one common factor: poor driver oversight by both the school districts and the contracted motor carriers, which resulted in unsafe operation of school buses," end of quote. The report found that the driver of the Baltimore school bus had, quote, "repeated license revocations and suspensions over several decades," end of quote. It had also uncovered instances in which the driver fraudulently obtained his license, as well as numerous moving violations. In addition, the driver had medical conditions, including a history of seizures that should have disqualified him from driving a school bus. In March 2017, the NTSB recommended that the Baltimore City Public Schools request a performance audit of the Transportation Department and then take corrective actions to improve internal controls. NTSB also recommended that the Maryland State Department of Education review the state regulations to clarify disqualifying conditions and require notification to the State Department of Education regarding all drivers who are determined to be not qualified to drive a school bus. NTSB also made several recommendations to the Maryland Motor Vehicle Administration. Dr. Poland, what is the status of the recommendations you made to the Baltimore City school system and to the state of Maryland?
So those early and urgent recommendations have certainly been updated. We received correspondence from Baltimore City Public Schools about the performance audit, and based on the correspondence and their actions, we have closed that recommendation with an acceptable action. There's another recommendation, as you mentioned, to Baltimore City Public Schools that they take corrective actions, and that recommendation is still open while they continue to do those corrective actions, and that is in an acceptable status. The recommendation to the Maryland State Department of Education addressing the COMAR, the Code of Maryland regulations is in a status of open acceptable response. So Maryland has communicated with us that they are working on that recommendation and they are in the process of implementing it, and we found that acceptable.
According to a report in the Baltimore Sun from March 2nd, 2018, the results of the audit of the Baltimore school system showed, and I quote, an accumulation of errors, including, quote, a systemic absence of leadership over an extended period of time, end of quote, and a failure, quote, to provide due diligence over the systems, end of quote, that were in place. Have steps been taken to address these findings and to implement corrective measures that will ensure no more individuals are able to drive school buses with disqualifying conditions in Maryland?
Maryland is currently working on implementing that, and I think importantly from that investigation, because we were able to share that on a nationwide level, other states are looking at those recommendations and examining their own systems to ensure that in other states they're having appropriate reporting and that action is being taken at the local level to remove drivers that are unsafe for a variety of reasons, as you mentioned.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cummings. Appreciate your attending. Are there any further questions from members of the subcommittee? Yes, sir, Ms. LaFalfa.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to just follow up where I left off on the last question. Ms. Poland ran out of time. Have you heard of anecdotes on or instances of vehicles, diesel vehicles being refitted with these filtration systems catching fire because of them? You know, whether it's trucks, buses, farm equipment. I can answer that on my own, but I'd rather hear yours.
Sure. So, as I mentioned earlier, our ongoing investigations and our previous investigations do not deal with that specific cause. Now, my background is biomechanical engineering. We have experts at the NTSB that are experts in fire safety and some of these post-crash fires. So we'd be happy to take your question back to see if there are some of our subject matter experts that are more familiar with your question.
It may not necessarily deal with crashes per se, but just are you getting that feedback? So, all right. And I'd like to follow up on what Mr. Cummings was talking about as well. We hear a lot of talk about technology coming to save the day here, but it really comes down to there's a human factor of those driving the buses and the people driving the cars. And so I think the focus we're going to have the most success is indeed how do we tighten that up? He was talking about qualifications for bus drivers, and I wonder, do we have anything close to a 50-state standard on who's eligible, what their record is, what their physical capabilities are for vision, for being able to, help students in situations? And I'd like to also follow that. I think Mr. Benish commented on it. Is there a 50-state standard, or do all states? We talked about. You said in California, and I'm used to it, is that if a child is going to cross the road, there's a whole lot of difference between letting kids off on the edge of the road and they go this way. But if they're to be crossing the road, if you got red lights, you should be stopping cars. We hear that they aren't. But if the driver is also getting out, the driver's the adult in this case, and they're the ones that should be trained and making sure that there's actually no cars coming when they make that commitment to go across the road, the other lane to the other side. So do we have a 50-state standard on the driver getting out with a sign or something to prevent the kid from just running across, the driver being the adult, before they cross that other lane to the other side of the road? And do we have a standard of, my previous thought there on drivers in general?
Currently, I do not think there is a standard across 50 states to do that. It's just in California, what I understand.
All right, it seems like that's the sensible thing, because again, the driver's the adult and all that. I'd like to, Ms. Poland, if you have stats too on when you talk about collisions with children by cars, are the vast majority of them on crossing the roadway, or is it happening on the safer side where they're getting out and just going away from the road? I would think that it's going to be, the vast majority are going to be the crossing the road. And if we're, enforcing on that better, then I think we can have a lot more success. Maybe it is the driver getting out as a 50-state standard, and also, just regular drivers, people have been driving a while, haven't taken the test in a while or whatever. I think we need to have a really great emphasis on the difference between a flashing yellow light on a bus and a flashing red light. Because, people are getting more and more, there's so many holdups in traffic, and if they don't take the bus seriously, you shouldn't, people don't stop for a flashing yellow light, there's no kids present. Once the traffic is stabilized, and this is again where more driver training needs to be in place, they shouldn't flick the red light on and start doing things until traffic is maybe calmed or there's a break in that. It's not an inconvenience, making drivers mad and all this stuff, because this driver rage is a big part of a lot of things. But there needs to be that finesse there of the yellow light to get things calmed down, and then the red light when you're actually going to have students. I know I give you a few things to think about there, but that seems to me where the success is going to be. And we hear a lot about technology saving the day. We got to have the top-notch drivers, and our people on the road, our car drivers, need to be a little more cognizant of the difference between yellow light is okay, slow down, red light, you got to stop, and the drivers differentiating. Go ahead, please comment, and I'll stop.
As you mentioned, this is a multifaceted approach for school bus transportation safety, from the human performance of the school bus driver and the drivers on the road around it, to those last-minute technological interventions that can prevent a crash, to protecting the occupants if a crash does happen. So I certainly appreciate your comments, and that's something that we'll consider as we move forward on our loading zone crashes.
Yeah, again, those stats I mentioned, if we could get those stats, maybe for the committee, or at least for my office, on are these crossing the road statistics by and large? Is it more 50-50? And is it while the bus is still there, or are kids getting hit even after the bus has left? Something like that would be very instructive on what we need to look at. So thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate the time.
I appreciate those questions. Perhaps you can get those statistics to the committee itself so we can put this, that the gentleman just asked for, so that we can put them in the record. They would be very important.
Yes, ma'am.
And I wonder, are there any further questions from members of the subcommittee? Seeing none, I want to thank each of the witnesses today for really very helpful testimony. Each and every one of you gave not only helpful information to us, but I must tell you, I think homework for us. When I came into this hearing, before I heard your testimony, I did not have what I would call an agenda. You've given me one now. Because of the detail of your helpful testimony. I ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing or that members have already asked and I've asked to be submitted. And unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. If no other members have anything to add, the subcommittee stands adjourned. Thank you for attending.